Still seem to be, if you someone could unmute Mr. Brown.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Great. Good afternoon. So as I just mentioned a moment, we will be joined, we are being joined virtually by our good friend Gordon Brown, who, as you know, serves as the UN Special Envoy for Global Education. He is joining us virtually, I think, from Edinburgh in Scotland, and he will be here to brief you on girls' education in Afghanistan. But before I give the floor to Gordon, I just want to flag that, as you know, this is the 2 years since the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, and the Secretary General believes that the people of Afghanistan have the right to a peaceful and harmonious future, and that the de facto authorities, the Taliban, have an obligation to ensure that this right is realized. The Deputy Secretary General noted that these 2 years have upturned the lives of Afghan women and girls, their rights and their futures. She stressed that we can't forget the people of Afghanistan, and we must amplify their voices in the fight for their rights to education and work. Also in Afghanistan, Sima Bahous, the head of UN Women, issued a statement in which she pointed out that through over 50 edicts, orders, and restrictions, the Taliban have left no aspects of women's lives untouched, no freedom spared, and she called on all actors to join us in supporting Afghan women in every way, elevating their priorities and voices and recommendations, funding services so they can desperately receive the support they need. For his part, Volker Turk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, reminded the de facto authorities that Afghanistan as a state has an obligation under international law to respect, uphold, and promote the human rights of all people without discrimination. So with that, I will now turn it over to Mr. Brown, and then we'll have the regular briefing after that. So Gordon, welcome again, and you have the floor.
Good afternoon. And I am here today, and it is exactly 2 years since the return of the Taliban to power, and it's 2 years since the start of a new repression. I'm here to salute and pay tribute to the determination, the courage, and the resilience of Afghan girls and Afghan women, who, even as millions of them are suffering poverty and hunger, have been fighting the most egregious, vicious, and indefensible violation of women's rights and girls' rights in the world today. The legal opinion we have received shows that the denial of education to Afghan girls and employment to Afghan women is gender discrimination, which should count as a crime against humanity, and it should be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. And so today, the international community must step up its efforts to restore the freedom of girls to go to school, women to university, to work, to walk in public places, and to enjoy basic liberties, and end what many have called gender apartheid against girls and women. In fact, 54 of around 80 edicts issued by the Taliban explicitly target women and girls and dismantle their rights. Just recently, the Taliban regime issued additional bans on women's and girls' participation in university exams, on visits to public places, including cemeteries and other activities. And as many of you know, the Ministry of Women's Affairs has become the feared ministry for the propagation of virtue and the prevention of vice, and the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission has been dissolved. So first, the International Criminal Court should recognize this gender discrimination as a crime against humanity and investigate it with a view to the arraignment and prosecution of those responsible. Secondly, monitoring, surveillance, and reporting of the gross abuses and the violations of rights should take place under current UN conventions that are being broken: the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we should back up the eloquent statements that Richard Bennett, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Afghanistan, has recently made. And on the basis of these reports, individual governments, including the United Kingdom and US governments, must follow the European Union to sanction those who are directly responsible for these decisions to discriminate against girls and women in Afghanistan. And I call today for the release of NGO leaders in prison who are imprisoned for defending women's and girls' rights. Third, the international community must show that education can get through to the people of Afghanistan in spite of the Afghan government's bans. And thus we will sponsor and fund internet learning. We will support underground schools, as well as support education for girls who are forced to leave Afghanistan and need our help to go to school. And then fourthly, I urge Muslim majority countries' leaders to support a delegation to the clerics of Kandahar to seek to persuade them to remove their ban on girls' education and women's employment, which has no basis in the Quran or the Islamic religion. And finally, the offer should be made that if schools are reopened under terms that allow girls proper rights and dignity, then the education aid that existed for 20 years and has been cut will now be restored. For women and girls in Afghanistan are facing a double hardship, not just the Taliban's denial of education and employment, but rising poverty and malnutrition. Women and girls make up 4 out of every 5 in greatest need in the country, the ones who are facing the deepest poverty and bearing the harshest burdens. But only 23% of the required funds for this year's humanitarian response plan has been received, and the World Food Programme is running out of money for Afghanistan. In a country where, according to the most recent figures, 8.8 million people currently require humanitarian aid, and 15 million are not getting the food they need. While the World Food Programme has been forced to slash rations and cash assistance to 8 million Afghans this year, after only a quarter of the required funds was received, and that compares to 40% this time last year. Now, without urgent funding, food assistance could shrink to nothing by October this year, while funding cuts have already led to the shutting down of basic health services in the country. So the international community can and will do more. An injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere. And we know that if we allow repression to go unchallenged in Afghanistan, it could spread to other countries. So let us support today the spirit of the Afghan women and girls who are withstanding even the harshest punishments that the Taliban can mete out. A regime like the Taliban can suppress dissent for a time, but not forever. They can shut down channels of information and communication, but eventually the world will get through. They can close down the schools girls go to, but they cannot close down their minds. But Afghan women who have had education for 20 years until 2021 know what it is like to be free. So the world must now step up our efforts on this particular day in support of courageous women and girls, and today say with one voice, the whole of the world, that is the Muslim and non-Muslim world, stands with them in their hour of greatest need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Edie Lederer, Associated Press.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown, on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing on this anniversary. As Steph said, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. Two follow-ups and a question. Have you visited Afghanistan and spoken to any of the Taliban leaders yourself? And have you talked to the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, or anyone from his office about looking into this issue of making this denial a crime against humanity? And my question is about underground and online education. How extensive is it, and what is the United Nations specifically prepared to do to foster online and underground education for Afghan girls? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the words of support, which I hope will be heard in Afghanistan. First of all, the International Criminal Court. I've written to Mr. Khan, the chief prosecutor. I've set out a legal opinion which gives the arguments about why this is a crime against humanity and why we should now consider gender discrimination to be part of that. And of course, there are many people in the United Nations family who have made exactly the same point. As you may know, the action that Mr. Khan and the International Criminal Court took against Russia when girls and boys had been moved against their will from Ukraine to Russia created a precedent for intervening on behalf of children in particular. And I'm confident that the International Criminal Court will see it in this light. So I'm in correspondence with him, and I hope to be able to have a letter from him that I can give to you at a later date. As far as visits to Afghanistan, I've visited Afghanistan many, many times, but not recently. My contacts have been through video conferencing, but I have talked to people who are determined to press for Afghan girls and women to have their basic rights. And I may want to add to this, I believe there's a split within the regime. I believe that there are many people in the education ministry and around the government who want to see the rights of girls restored to education. But I believe that the clerics in Kandahar have stood firmly against that and indeed continue to issue instructions, the latest being that girls cannot visit or women cannot visit public places, including cemeteries where loved ones are buried. So I believe that the pressure that I'm asking that be stepped up, particularly by the leaders of Muslim-majority countries, could be effective. We've got to persuade these clerics that it's a false interpretation of Islam to suggest that girls and women should not be able to have the basic rights enjoyed by men. And that is not the case in most Muslim-majority countries, and indeed Muslim countries across the world. Now, you asked about underground schools and about the support that we're giving to internet learning. There is a new initiative in the last few weeks to increase the amount of information that is coming on mobile phones and a curriculum through it to girls who want to study in Afghanistan. In other words, education will get through even if the regime is opposed to it. There are a number of organizations that are supporting underground schools. And of course, it's better not to talk in more detail about them for fear that they could be closed down. But there is no doubt that girls are still trying to learn, sometimes risking a lot to be able to do so. We are also helping Afghan girls who leave Afghanistan, and many, of course, are in Pakistan. And that's where, of course, education is at a premium. And we ought to be doing more to help those regions of Pakistan where some Afghan girls are now hosted. So we have got to show that even if the Afghan regime does not approve of education, that education information can get through, knowledge can cross boundaries, and that they cannot forestall on the right of girls to education forever. And I believe that governments will be able to provide more money in the next year to enable all these initiatives in education to happen. And I'm certainly talking to the United Kingdom government about them doing more next year, in the next year, to help girls who are trying to get education in the most difficult circumstances. In other words, our pressure is not just on the regime through delegations and not just through putting the regime before the International Criminal Court and sanctions. It is also to show that education can actually continue even in the most difficult circumstances, although never ideal. It's important that we show that they cannot stop the word getting through forever.
Thank you. Pam, Ibtisam, and then Miriam.
Thank you. Thank you for the briefing. A few follow-up questions. First, can you explain how Education Can't Wait that launched today deals with Afghanistan? The second is, are there talks? I mean, there were talks between the UN with the DSG and others. Any more talks? Any proposed talks? Have they totally stalled? The third is, how dangerous is it for Afghan girls to participate in online training? And the fourth is just, is there a way we can get your legal brief to the ICC? Thank you. I'm sorry, it's Pamela Falk from CBS.
Yeah, Pamela, thank you. These are very important questions. First of all, Education Cannot Wait has launched a campaign today I'm the chairman of Education Cannot Wait. Yasmin Sharif is the director, and she's got a number of girls who've left Afghanistan who are speaking out about the need for their fellow students to get education. And Education Cannot Wait joins many other organizations like UNICEF and the Global Partnership for Education, who are all trying to provide resources to help education continue in Afghanistan. So while we can't say a great deal about the underground schools, we can assure you that where we see education being offered, we are prepared to help finance it. But obviously, we've got to think about the safety of girls. I think you'll find in some provinces that the regime is less strict than in other provinces. So if you like, the scope of the edict and the severity of these edicts does vary from province to province. So there is a chance of a more moderate approach in some areas, and we would want that to continue, obviously, so that girls get education. You asked about delegations. America did have a delegation to Afghanistan. Of course, Amina Mohammed went to Afghanistan. Britain has been talking to Afghanistan. There was a meeting in Doha very recently to talk about the very issue of education. So it is not that there is no dialogue with the regime. That dialogue is happening at the moment. And I think the point that I was making earlier, that we detect a split in the regime, that there's not total agreement on imposing this interdict against girls' education. And we know that the pressure has all come from Kandahar rather than from Kabul. And that's why I'm very keen that clerics and other leaders visit from particularly countries where there's a Muslim majority and where they can make it clear to the leadership in Kandahar that they're out of sync with the rest of the Muslim world in trying to continue to ban education for girls and deny women rights. So I do think that there is a dialogue, and I do think that we detect some possibility of progress. But until, of course, we can persuade not just the government itself, but the clerics that something must change, we will still have this terrible situation where, as I repeat, this is the worst example of the abuse of human rights against girls and women around the world. And if we allow this to happen and continue with impunity, then others may try to do exactly the same. And we cannot allow the message to be sent out that there is any equanimity, there is any moral equivalence about allowing girls to be denied these rights. We are determined that these girls have these rights.
Thank you. And your legal brief?
The legal opinion, I can give you a summary of this, and I will arrange for that to be available. I want, obviously, to send the opinion itself to the legal channels, but I will give you a summary of the results of that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We can distribute that for you. Ibtissam and then Miriam.
Hi, my name is Ibtissam Azim, Al Arab Al Jadid newspaper. Just quick follow-up on the legal issue. What are the next steps then? And then my question, you touched upon the issue of sending delegations from the Muslim and Arab world, and you did say that there were some delegations. I guess my question here, what do you believe that haven't been done until now that should be done? Is there more pressure that should be put in on the Taliban that countries, whether Muslim countries or even Western countries, are not doing? Thank you.
Yes, I think we've got to do more. I think I would say I'm disappointed that there is not sufficient public pressure from the rest of the world on the Afghan regime on this issue. I think everybody has made statements saying it's unacceptable, and I applaud all the countries of the Middle East because they have made these statements saying that under no circumstances can they condone the denial of rights to education to girls in Afghanistan. But pressure is more than simply words, and that's why I'm appealing for a delegation to be sent, hopefully involving all the major Muslim countries. And that is where I think we can have the greatest influence on the Taliban regime. This is not the West versus Afghanistan. This is not one religion against another. This is everybody uniting to say that the clerics in Kandahar have misunderstood what the religious teaching of Islam is on this issue of girls' education. And therefore, it's important that the Muslim majority countries are the people who make, if you like, a major effort on a delegation that I think would have to be taken seriously by the Afghan regime. When it comes to the legal issues here, education is, of course, an enabling right, as we understand it, in relation to human rights under the United Nations Convention. The Taliban's educational prohibitions are gender-based persecution, as you understand. So this is gender discrimination and gender persecution. And according to the ICC, which issued in December last year, policy on the crime of gender persecution, so they issued a statement on this, actions that deprive individuals of their fundamental rights, including education, would fall under this category. So the first stage would be the ICC hopefully would announce an investigation, and then they would announce charges, and then, of course, they would detail the people who are held responsible for this as individuals. And I think this would be a major step forward, not just in protecting girls' rights in Afghanistan, but a general statement that gender persecution and gender discrimination, what some call gender apartheid, can no longer be accepted in any notion that we have of a civilized world.
Thank you. Miriam, then Ephraim, and then Yvonne.
Thanks, Mr. Brown. This is Mariam Rahmati with Afghanistan International. You mentioned a couple of times about the Supreme Leader and how the decisions are made in Kandahar. Taliban officials in Kabul have said recently and in the past couple of days that the leader, the Supreme Leader himself, decided to close the school doors for girls. And till he decides to change his mind, the school doors are going to be closed. So what is the UN and the delegation that you're trying to send is doing to make more efforts to get in touch with the Supreme Leader himself, since he is the one who is making all these decisions and placing all these bans on women? And also there are, my second question, there are concerns about the changes that the Taliban are bringing to the curriculum of education in Afghanistan, in boys' schools in particular, and the rise of radicalism. Is UN worried about this at all, and what kind of efforts are in place to address this issue? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to stray beyond my own remit in education and in the defense of girls' and women's rights. I think there are different impressions that have come from visits to Afghanistan about the support that the Afghan regime is giving or not giving to other terrorist movements around the world. But I do think you're absolutely right. The pressure has got to be on those who make the decisions. But I do have no doubt that it is in Kandahar that the religious interpretations are being made that are justifying the political decisions. And it's there where I think we've got to exercise more pressure. And if religious clerics were able to show, as they can, that Islam is actually favorable to girls' education, and that Afghan cannot succeed as a country if it denies half its potential citizens the rights of education, then I think we can make progress. We think 2.5 million girls are being denied education, 3 million more are about to leave primary school in the next few years, and therefore they will be denied education. So we're losing the talents of a whole generation, and that means we don't have teachers, we don't have doctors, we don't have nurses, we don't have those people who can be qualified to make a success of the Afghan economy. So we make a religious argument, we make a moral argument, and we make an economic argument. And I think the more we can press this, and I agree with you, more has to be done to pressure directly the regime, then I think we can look forward to be more successful in the next year than we've been in the last 2 years.
Thank you. Ephraim?
Thank you so much. Ephraim Kosaifi from Arab News Daily. Two short questions. From the impression from all the briefings we have had here from people who have been to Kandahar and came back, apparently the Taliban know very well that Middle Eastern countries, Muslim countries are out of sync with them. They said it themselves that, you know, we're not on the same page with Saudi Arabia or with the rest of the Middle East in terms of women rights and everything else. So could you just elaborate a little bit on what you mean, but what kind of pressure now is needed from Muslim countries? Because apparently the message is there and well understood. Second, there's been this debate over the recognition of the Taliban. Some argue that recognizing them would grant the international community much needed access to working in Afghanistan, and others say that recognition would divest the international community from the only levers that it's got. What are your, can you weigh in on that, please? Thank you.
These are two very important questions. The answer to your first question, I think, is this, that the religious claims that are made by the clerics in Kandahar have got to be contested and directly contested. And you say that people well understand that there's a difference of opinion, but I think this is a difference of interpretation that has got to be contested all the time. And I do repeat that we believe that there is a split within the regime. It is not, as perhaps your question may suggest, that there's a general consensus that Afghanistan is going its own way and that everybody's agreed on that. That is not the case. We believe there are many people within the Afghan Ministry of Education itself, and of course many teachers, who want to get the girls back to school. You also asked about recognition, and that's a wider question than, of course, girls going back to school. Recognition would involve a whole series of other issues that would be on the table, including the freezing of assets and what support Afghan political leaders are giving to other regimes and everything else. And I think it is better for us to look on it this way, that if the Afghan leadership were prepared to open the schools, that's the secondary schools, and give girls who are teenagers the chance of education and allow women to go to university, then we would bring back the aid that was available between 2001 and 2021. So we could do that irrespective of recognition. We could get to a situation where we would help the Afghan girls get back to school by providing the funding that clearly is not available. The more Afghan faces terrible issues of starvation and hardship.
Thank you. Yvonne, then Linda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. This is Yvonne Murray from RTE News Ireland. I have two quick questions. The first question is, looking back, do you think it was a mistake for Britain and the United States to involve themselves militarily in Afghanistan, given that the Taliban is now firmly back in power? My second question is on the women's groups in Afghanistan, who I often speak to, say that the international community has abandoned them and that not enough political will has been shown by the international community to do something to help them. Can I please have your comments on that?
Yeah, you've got two questions there. One, I really don't want to, if you like, dilute this discussion about the present day by going back 20 years. But I think you remember that this was in respect of the Al-Qaeda bombing and tracing things back to Afghanistan. And so action had to be taken. I think the question of what assumptions were then made about what was possible in Afghanistan is an open question. But just remember, 6 million girls got education where otherwise they would not have it. And it's this loss of the freedom to be educated that makes it so much worse for girls in Afghanistan now, because women know what it is like, as I said, to be free. You are right that we have not done enough, and we must do more. And that's why I'm speaking today, and you've heard the statements from the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, and many of the UN special agencies and representatives. There is a unanimity that we must do more. And I'm suggesting these 5 things today that would make a difference. And it would be pressure in different areas, but to achieve the same result, that girls are back to school. Pressure judicially through the ICC, pressure through sanctions of the individuals, pressure through showing that education can get through, even if the Taliban are trying to stop it, pressure through delegations that raise the religious questions, and pressure through promising that education funding would be available if girls got back to school under conditions that allowed them to have proper dignity. So I think you can see that there's a coordinated attempt now to push further. And I hope that this message will be received in Afghanistan. And I did mention that a number of NGO leaders were either in prison or there was threat of imprisonment. And of course, we want to send out our solidarity to them in their hour of need, and understand that the demonstrations that have taken place, often when girls have been, or women have been under the threat of arrest, show just how much Afghan girls and women are trying hard themselves to promote education, and why we, who are safer than they are because they're at risk, we should be doing more to support them.
Thank you. Linda, then Evelyn.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. This is Linda Fasulo with NBC at the UN.
Linda, thank
I'm
you.
sorry, not NBC, NPR.
NPR.
Was NBC.
Sorry.
Excuse me. My question has to do with the underground schooling, which, of course, the UN is working to provide help, and various states. Following up on this discussion so far, I was just wondering, how prevalent is this underground schooling? In other words, do you think 10% of which girls and women are receiving some kinds of underground education, or is it more than that, less than that? What do you hope it to be? And secondly, in terms of online education, is that something that the Taliban, that might be more vulnerable to the Taliban's cutting it off, or, ending it?
First of all, you're absolutely right that underground schools are important, although we've got to be careful that we protect those people who are running them as well as those people who are attending them. There has been a difference because in the first year, organizations like BRAC from Bangladesh and the Aga Khan Foundation were able still to provide education. And at the same time, there was finance coming in from the UK government and many other governments that I know. And there's been a tightening since. And that's why, of course, we are more concerned now than ever because of that happening. But yes, we will support underground schools, and we'll do that the way that is possible without announcing where the money is going. And secondly, there has been a very big concerted attempt in the last few months connecting in education to use universities' internet curricula that can be transferred on the internet, and school curricula to get it through, because mobile phones are quite common, as you know, in Afghanistan, and the message can get through them. So we have tried, I think, a number of different ways. And the whole point is pressure on the Afghan regime will come not just because they're exposed for erroneous interpretation of Islam, and not just because, obviously, there are criminal proceedings, but pressure will come if we can show that education can still get through even in the most difficult of circumstances. And we give young people in Afghanistan hope that something will change soon. And if the regime were to recognize they can't stop this forever, then it might be something that promotes a change of policy. So it's a 5-point plan, I think I'm announcing today, that I'm supporting at least, and I think is a multiplicity of pressures that the regime will face over the next year.
Thank you.
Gordon, if you're okay, we'll just take a few more questions.
Yep.
Evelyn, then we'll go to the screen.
Hello, it's good seeing you again, or at least hearing you. Evelyn Leopold.
Thank you. I'm sorry, not with you.
Evelyn Leopold, Globetrotter
Thank you,
Media,
Evelyn.
Fast Blue. How is the economy doing? Is the withholding of funds because of the discrimination against women and girls, is it having an impact on the on the economy? Or do they have enough resources that they can sort of ignore that?
I would say that if the schools were reopened, we would provide money, and I would urge all governments, irrespective of the lack of recognition of the regime, to help education continue, as to some extent it did for a few months after the Taliban took over with support from the aid budgets of different governments. As far as the economy is concerned, I don't think we can ignore the figures that I've just given you, that the humanitarian appeals are not being followed in the response that is sufficient for humanitarian aid to be provided. And in particular, the World Food Programme has warned us that they could run out of money by October. They've already had to cut back on supplies. And obviously that means that women and girls are in the main the worst affected by this. And so healthcare services have been cut as well as a result of aid not getting through. So I hope that the regime will realize that we can get support back if they are to behave in a way that's acceptable. But equally, we've got agencies that are still working in Afghanistan despite the attempt to ban women in their employment. They're still working, and we need to fund them properly, the World Food Programme and the Humanitarian Aid Programme. And I would urge people to do this, and I hope that one of the messages coming out of today is that the suffering of Afghan girls and women in particular has been intense, and what we can do to relieve that suffering in the area of food and humanitarian aid, we should now do far more.
Thank you. We'll go to Abdelhamid. Abdelhamid Sam, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Sir, I just want to say one thing. I was among the first UN staff to arrive in Kabul. I arrived on November 18, and I saw the bodies scattered in the street. I spoke to everyone. Everyone was jubilant and happy to see Taliban is gone. But they also told me that we are scared that the US will make the same mistake they made in 1989 when the Soviets were defeated and Taliban will come back. Exactly. 20 years, sir, of the US domination, if we don't want to call it occupation. 20 years, they were unable to build a modern state with institutions. And Taliban did not defeat the US presence from outside, they defeated it from inside. Why the majority of the Afghani people turn against the US and turn to support and embrace Taliban to bring this kind of medieval regime to do what they are doing now? Thank you very much for the question.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and we can debate mistakes that were made between 20, the first year of the century, and 2021. And that is a legitimate debate. My visits to Afghanistan on many occasions were about education and health. And we were trying to build an education system that would give the country the freedom not just for girls to study, but for economic development, to make the country wealthier and more prosperous. And we were trying to build a modern system of healthcare that was better than what had gone before. And I still think the Afghan people will want to see education for girls, and they don't support the Taliban's view that girls should not have the right to secondary education. And of course, the loss of healthcare services is putting lives at risk. So rather than go back on the last 20 years, and I appreciate what you're saying on this, I think the important thing to recognize is there is a lot that can be done now, which I think is more in accord with the wishes of the Afghan people than a ban on education for girls.
Thank you.
Last question will go to Iftikhar Ali, Associated Press of Pakistan. Iftikhar?
Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. By now, most questions on the subject have been asked, but I'll ask you, Prime Minister Brown, whether the proposal you have made for a delegation of representatives of Muslim-majority countries to visit Afghanistan and speak to the Kandahar leadership is just an appeal, or you have formally taken over with Muslim-majority countries, and which countries have you spoken? And in this connection, I would also like to ask you whether you are in touch with the Secretary General of the OIC.
I have talked to a number of countries about this. I'm obviously not the leading person in terms of relationships with some of these countries, either for the United Nations or for my own country, but I have talked to a number of people about how this delegation could be constituted. You perhaps know there have been many meetings, particularly in Doha, where the different groups have come together. But I don't think that is a substitute now for actually going to the country and talking to people in Kandahar in particular, as well as, of course, in Kabul. And so instead of perhaps a continuation of meetings taking place outside the country. There have been some delegations, but mainly to Kabul. I'm suggesting, and I wouldn't name them, but I think you know the main countries that we're talking about. They are in a position to influence this regime, and we want to support them in their efforts to do so. And the statements that have been made by all the countries that I'm referring to are very strong indeed. Their defense of girls' education, their abhorrence of the loss of the rights of women as well as girls. And now I think we need a spirited attempt to go into the country with a delegation that can make something of a difference. So I come back to this: judicial sanctions, the whole issue of getting education through channels that the regime cannot successfully stop, and then pressure through delegations that are mainly going to be effective if they're from the countries that we're talking about. So I think look at this as an agenda for action. We have not done enough over the last 2 years. Despite all the strong words, we can do more if we combine all these different potential initiatives into one spirited attempt. I don't want another year to go by when girls in Afghanistan and women there feel that they are powerless because we have not done enough to support them. And I think we can do many things that have been suggested today and suggested by other very excellent representatives of the United Nations.
Gordon, on those words, we want to thank you very much for taking the time and be here on this somber 2-year mark. And we hope to see you back here very soon and in person. Take care.
Steph, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you all.
Take care. Thank you. Great, thank you. If you have the patience, we'll go back to our regular programming. You hear from me and then Paulina. Just a couple of updates for you. One on Ukraine, where the humanitarian coordinator, Denise Brown, today condemned another wave of attacks impacting civilians and civilian infrastructure in areas hundreds of kilometers away from the front lines. Our humanitarian colleagues on the ground note that homes, water supplies, health, sports facilities were damaged by the strikes in central, northwestern, and western parts of the country, including in a preschool in Lviv, close to the border with Poland. Denise Brown highlighted that millions of people uprooted by the war were seeking shelters in the areas that were hit. Turning to Sudan, 4 months after the current hostilities got underway in Sudan, humanitarian leaders today urged action to end the crisis. In a statement by the principals of the Interagency Standing Committee, leaders of the various humanitarian organizations asked the parties to the conflict in Sudan to end fighting, protect innocent civilian lives, grant humanitarian safe and unhindered access. Leaders reminded the international community that more than 6 million people in Sudan are one step away from famine, and more than 14 million children in the country need humanitarian help. They assured the people of Sudan that the international humanitarian community remains committed to supporting them. Since the beginning of these current hostilities, over 4.3 million people have been forced to flee. That's according to UN Refugee Agency. Within Sudan, 3.2 million men, women, and children have been internally displaced. That includes 187,000 refugees who had sought shelter in Sudan. The UN Human Rights Office says that tentative figures indicate that more than 4,000 people have so far been killed, including hundreds of civilians. These include 28 humanitarian health workers and 435 children. The actual number, obviously, is likely to be much higher. Quick note from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where our peacekeeping colleagues continue to support efforts to protect civilians amid increasing attacks by Codeco armed group in Ituri province. In response to an ambush by the armed groups in the Charu Bridge, about 24 kilometers from Jugu, the mission deployed peacekeepers from its standing combat deployment. This was the third reported attack by the same group in the area in about a week. UN peacekeepers intervened on both previous occasions and are continuing to patrol the areas. And at the start of the electoral campaign for the presidential, legislative, and municipal elections in Gabon that are scheduled for August 26, we call on all stakeholders to ensure a peaceful, inclusive, and credible electoral process and urge all political stakeholders to refrain from any inflammatory action or speech that could undermine the process. And lastly, just want to flag a press release from our colleagues at the UN support mission in Libya, who today expressed their concern about security incidents and developments in Tripoli and their impact on the civilian population. The mission reminds all parties involved of their responsibility under international law to protect civilians. The mission is also concerned about the possible impacts of these developments on the ongoing efforts to cultivate an environment that is conducive to advancing the political process, including preparations for national elections. The mission calls for an immediate de-escalation and an end to the ongoing armed clashes. Violence is not acceptable means to resolve disagreements. All parties must preserve the security gains achieved in recent years and address differences through dialogue. I will now engage in a dialogue with you, Edie.
Thank you, Steph. First, on Syria cross-border operations, is there any update on when a first convoy might go through Bab al-Hawa?
No update to share with you. There are a number of operational details that need to be ironed out, and I can tell you that we are determined to go as quickly as possible.
And on Niger, can you tell us what the special representative for West Africa is doing and whether the UN is taking any additional actions?
We are continuing our efforts supporting the ECOWAS and the African Union mediation. Our special representative is in contact with all relevant parties, but nothing to share with you at this point above the waterline.
Is he still in Nigeria, in Abuja?
No, I believe he is in. He was in Liberia yesterday. I have to find out where he is today. They would share that information with me. Pamela.
Thank you, Steph. As a follow-up to what Gordon Brown said, have there been contacts with Amina Mohammed, the DSG, with the Taliban as follow-up to that last trip? And is there an ongoing?
No, I'm not. I mean, our contacts with the de facto authorities continue through our political mission on the ground. I'm not aware that the DSG's had any direct contacts from them.
And anything you can add to the ongoing dialogue with the mission and
I mean, there's
de facto?
There's nothing
authorities?
positive to add. I mean,
Okay.
you heard a very bleak picture from Gordon Brown. You heard very bleak words from the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, the head of UN Women, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and others.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, that's an answer. Thank you.
Miriam.
Do you have any update when it's going to be the second meeting that the SG is going to have with the special envoys in the
No,
future? Any
not at this
update?
point. As soon as I do, I will share that with you.
Thank you.
All right. I don't think there's a question on. Oh, Abdelhamid, you have a question. Sorry.
Yes, I have. Thank you so much, Stéphane. This morning, Israel killed 2 Palestinians in Jericho. One of them, Qusay Omar al-Walaji, he's 16-year-old. However, we didn't hear anything from the UN.
I haven't.
Is there any statement or any comment on this incident?
I haven't seen those reports, but you should also check with Mr. Veneslan's office. Okay.
And my second
yes,
question.
please. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yahael Andor, that settler who killed Qusay Jamal Mu'tan on August 4, and in the statement of Winston, he said he was happy to see the Israeli arresting 2 people. He was released from detention. The U.S. was annoyed with that, and they called that incident a terrorist action. yet they still released him. Do you have any also
Well,
another comment on
my understanding, and I may be wrong, but that the judicial proceedings are still going on underway, and it is clear that there needs to be accountability for any violence, especially when there is a loss of life and a killing of a civilian.
Thank you.
Ms. Salume, I was about to go.
Not yet, not yet. Thank you. The Secretary General's report on Haiti, I believe, has been delivered to the Security Council. I'm wondering if he's confident that there is enough support from the countries that have come forward so far as troop contributors to make that international force that he's been recommending and continues to recommend.
You know, I think the Secretary General indeed sent that letter to the presidency of the Security Council with different support options the UN can provide. What he put forward is really complementary to what he had said earlier on recommendation for a non-UN multinational force to support the Haitian police. I think he did that back in October of last year, and he's briefed you on that here. It's, you know, whether or not there is enough resources put forward by different member states or groups of member states that coalesce into a non-UN police force. I think that'll be clear when it's clear. And when those member states, a group of member states, coalesce and announce that they have found a path forward. And we very much hope that when that happens, there will be full support from the Security Council.
And how long does he think it would take to get this force activated
Well,
and UN support in place?
You know, the UN support will depend obviously on some probably tweaks to the mandate and more financial support. But the bigger picture is the international, the non-UN force. How long it takes is up to those member states who are willing to step forward, who have the capacity to step forward. And we know a number of them have expressed interest to participate or to support. We hope those efforts move as quickly as possible. In the meantime, we know very well what the horrendous security situation is on the ground in Haiti, and the horrendous humanitarian situation as well as a result that keeps getting worse as a result of the deteriorating security situation. You're welcome. Paulina. Taking all my stuff with me. There we go.